The Nintendo 64, stylized as Nintendo 64 and often referred to as N64, is Nintendo's third home video game console for the international market. Named for its 64-bit central processing unit, it was released in June 1996 in Japan, September 1996 in North America, March 1997 in Europe and Australia, September 1997 in France and December 1997 in Brazil. It is the industry's last major home console to use the cartridge as its primary storage format, although current handheld systems also use cartridges. While the Nintendo 64 was succeeded by Nintendo's mini-DVD-based GameCube in November 2001. The consoles remained available until the system was retired in late 2003. Codenamed Project Reality, the console's design was mostly finalized by mid-1995, though Nintendo 64's launch was delayed until 1996. As part of the fifth generation of gaming, the system competed primarily with the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. The Nintendo 64 was launched with 3 games: Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64, released worldwide, and Saikyo Habu Shogi, released only in Japan. The Nintendo 64's suggested retail price at launch was $199.99, and it was later marketed with the slogan, "Get In, or Get Out." With 32.93 million units worldwide, the console was ultimately released in a range of different colors and designs, and an assortment of limited edition controllers were sold or used as contest prizes during the system's lifespan. IGN named it the 9th greatest video game console of all time, and in 1996, Time magazine named it Machine of the Year. History. Development. At the heart of the Project Reality system will be a version of the MIPS multimedia engine, a chipset consisting of a 64-bit MIPS RISC microprocessor, a graphics coprocessor chip and application-specific integrated circuits. The product, which will be developed specifically for Nintendo, will be unveiled in arcades in 1994, and will be available for home use by late 1995. The target U.S. price for the home system is below $250 for the first time. Leading-edge MIPS RISC microprocessor technology will be used in the video entertainment industry, and already powers computers ranging from PCs to supercomputers. SGI press release. August 23, 1993. At the beginning of the 1990s, Nintendo led the video game industry with its Nintendo Entertainment System. Although a follow-up console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, was successful, sales took a hit from the Japanese recession. Competition from longtime rival Sega, as well as relative newcomer Sony, emphasized Nintendo's need to develop a successor for the SNES, or risk losing market dominance to its rivals. Further complicating matters, Nintendo also faced a backlash from third-party developers unhappy with Nintendo's strict licensing policies. Silicon Graphics, Inc., a longtime leader in graphics visualization and supercomputing, was interested in expanding its business by adapting its technology into the higher volume realm of consumer products, starting with the video game market. Based upon its MIPS R4000 family of supercomputing and workstation CPUs, SGI developed a CPU requiring a fraction of the resources, consuming only 0.5 watts of power instead of 1.5 to 2 watts, with an estimated target price of $40 instead of $80-200. The company created a design proposal for a video game system, seeking an already well-established partner in that market. James H. Clark, founder of SGI, initially offered the proposal to Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega of America. The next candidate was Nintendo. The historical details of these preliminary negotiations were controversial between the two competing suitors. Tom Kalinske said that he and Joe Miller of Sega of America were quite impressed with SGI's prototype, inviting their hardware team to travel from Japan to meet with SGI. The engineers from Sega of Japan claimed that their evaluation of the early prototype had uncovered several unresolved hardware issues and deficiencies. Those were subsequently resolved, but Sega had already decided against SGI's design. Nintendo resisted that summary conclusion, arguing that the reason for SGI's ultimate choice of partner is due to Nintendo having been a more appealing business partner than Sega. While Sega demanded exclusive rights to the chip, Nintendo was willing to license the technology on a non-exclusive basis. Michael Slater, publisher of Microprocessor Reports, said, "The mere fact of a business relationship there is significant because of Nintendo's phenomenal ability to drive volume. If it works at all, it could bring MIPS to levels of volume." SGI never dreamed of. James Clark met with Nintendo CEO Hiroshi Yamauchi in early 1993, thus initiating Project Reality. On August 23, 1993, the two companies announced a global joint partnership and licensing agreement surrounding Project Reality, projecting that the yet unnamed eventual product would be developed specifically for Nintendo, will be unveiled in arcades in 1994, and will be available for home use by late 1995, below $250. This announcement coincided with Nintendo's August 1993 Shoshinkai trade show. As with most of the computing industry, Nintendo had limited experience with 3D graphics, and worked with several outside companies to develop the technology comprising the console. Some chip technology was provided by NEC, Toshiba, and Sharp. SGI had recently acquired MIPS Computer Systems, and the two worked together toward a low-cost real-time 3D graphics hardware system. SGI and its subsidiary MIPS Technologies were responsible for the R430i microprocessor and the 3D graphics hardware used in the Nintendo 64. The initial Project Reality software development platform was developed and sold by SGI in the form of its $100,000 $250,000 Onyx supercomputer, loaded with the namesake $50,000 Reality Engine 2 graphics boards and four 150 MHz R4400 CPUs, and with early Project Reality application and emulation APUS. By purchasing and developing upon this graphics supercomputing platform, Nintendo and its select game developer partners could fully prototype their games according to SGI's estimated console performance, prior to the finalization of the console hardware specifications. That software-based console prototype platform was later supplanted by a workstation-hosted console simulation board, representing the finalized console hardware. SGI's performance estimates based upon their Reality Engine supercomputing platform were ultimately reported to be fairly accurate to the final consumer console product. The console's design was publicly revealed for the first time in late Q2 1994. Images of the console displayed the Nintendo Ultra 64 logo, a ROM cartridge, but no controller. This prototype console's form factor would be retained by the product eventually launched as Nintendo 64, having initially indicated the possibility of utilizing the increasingly popular CD-ROM if the medium's endemic performance problems were solved. The company now announced a much faster but space-limited cartridge-based system, which prompted open analysis by the gaming press. The system was frequently marketed as the world's first 64-bit gaming system. Atari had already claimed to have made the first 64-bit game console with their Atari Jaguar, but the Jaguar only uses a general 64-bit architecture in conjunction with two 32-bit RISC processors and a 16/32 Motorola 68000. For more details on Nintendo's storage strategies, see Nintendo 64 Game Pack and 64DD. Later in Q2 1994, Nintendo signed a licensing agreement with Midway's parent company which enabled Midway to develop and market arcade games using the Project Reality hardware and formed a joint venture company called Williams Nintendo to market Nintendo-exclusive home conversions of these games. The result is two arcade games, Killer Instinct and Cruisin' USA, which boasted their upcoming release on the arcade branch of the Nintendo Ultra 64 platform. Compared to the console branch of Ultra 64, the arcade branch uses a different MIPS CPU, has no Reality coprocessor, and uses onboard ROM chips and a hard drive instead of a cartridge. Killer Instinct features pre-rendered character artwork and CG movie backgrounds that are streamed off the hard drive and animated as the characters move horizontally. The completed Nintendo 64 was fully unveiled to the public in a playable form on November 24, 1995, at the 7th annual Shoshinkai Software Exhibition in Japan. Nintendo's next-generation console was introduced as the Nintendo 64, contrary to speculation that it would be called Nintendo Ultra 64. Photos of the event were disseminated on the web by Game Zero magazine 2 days later. Official coverage by Nintendo followed later via the Nintendo Power website and print magazine. In the lead-up to the console's release, Nintendo had adopted a new global branding strategy, assigning the console the same name for all markets, Nintendo 64. Previously, the plan had been to release the console as the Ultra Famicom in Japan and as the Nintendo Ultra 64 in other markets. Nintendo said that trademark issues were not a factor, and the sole reason for the name change was to establish a single worldwide brand and logo for the console. The prefix for the model numbering scheme for hardware and software across the Nintendo 64 platform is NUS, a reference to the console's original name, Nintendo Ultra 64. The console was originally slated for release by Christmas of 1995. In May 1995, Nintendo pushed back the release to April 1996. The prospect of a release the following year at a lower price than the competition lowered sales of competing Sega and Sony consoles during the important Christmas shopping season. Electronic Gaming Monthly editor Ed Semrad even suggested that Nintendo may have announced the April 1996 release date with this end in mind, knowing in advance that the system would not be ready by that date. In its explanation of the delay, Nintendo claimed it needed more time for Nintendo 64 software to mature, and for third-party developers to produce games. Adrian Sfrt, a former engineer for SGI, attributed the delay to hardware problems. He claimed that the chips underperformed in testing and were being redesigned. In 1996, the Nintendo 64's software development kit was redesigned as the partner N64 system by Kyoto Microcomputer Co., Ltd. of Japan, to counter the possibility that gamers would grow impatient with the wait for the Nintendo 64 and purchase one of the several competing consoles already on the market. Nintendo ran ads for the system well in advance of its announced release dates, with slogans like, "Wait for it," and "Is it worth the wait? Only if you want the best." Release Popular Electronics called the launcher much hyped, long-anticipated moment. The console was first released in Japan on June 23, 1996. The Nintendo 64 was first sold in North America on September 26, 1996, despite having been advertised for the 29th. It was launched with just 2 games in the United States, Pilot Wings 64 and Super Mario 64. In 1994, prior to the launch, Nintendo of America chairman Howard Lincoln emphasized the quality of first-party games, saying, "We're convinced that a few great games at launch are more important than great games mixed in with a lot of dogs." The PAL version of the console was released in Europe on March 1, 1997. Originally intended to be priced at $250, the console was ultimately launched at $199.99 to make it competitive with Sony and Sega offerings. Nintendo priced the console as an impulse purchase, a strategy from the toy industry. The price of the console in the United States was further reduced in August 1998. Promotion to boost sales during this low post-Christmas season. Nintendo and General Mills worked together on a promotional campaign that appeared in early 1999. A television advertising campaign cost $5 million. The advertisement by Saatchi & Saatchi, New York began on January 25 and encouraged children to buy fruit by the foot snacks for tips to help them with their Nintendo 64 games. 90 different tips were available, with 3 variations of 30 tips each. Nintendo advertised its fantastic series of peripherals with a $10 million print and television campaign from February 28 to April 30, 2000. Leo Burnett, Chicago, was in charge. Reception. Critical reception. The Nintendo 64 received generally positive reviews from critics. Reviewers generally praised the console's advanced 3D graphics and gameplay, while criticizing the lack of games. On G4 TechV's filter, the Nintendo 64 was voted up to No. 1 by registered users. In February 1996, Next Generation magazine called the Nintendo Ultra 64 the best-kept secret in video games, and the world's most powerful game machine. It called the system's November 24, 1995 unveiling at Shoshinkai the most anticipated video gaming event of the 1990s, possibly of all time, previewing the Nintendo 64 shortly prior to its launch. Time magazine praised the realistic movement and gameplay provided by the combination of fast graphics processing, pressure-sensitive controller, and the Super Mario 64 game. The review praised the fastest, smoothest game action yet attainable via joystick at the service of equally virtuoso motion, where F or once the movement on the screen feels real. At launch, the Los Angeles Times called the system, quite simply, the fastest, most graceful game machine on the market. Its form factor was described as small, light, and built for heavy play by kids, unlike the relatively fragile Sega Saturn, showing concern for a major console product launched during a sharp, several-year-long decline in the game console market. The review said that the long-delayed Nintendo 64 was worth the wait, in the company's pursuit of quality. Nintendo's penchant for perfection, in-game quality control was praised, though with concerns about having only 2 launch titles at retail and 12 expected by Christmas. Describing the quality control incentives associated with cartridge-based development, The Times cited Nintendo's position that cartridge game developers tend to place a premium on substance over flash, and noted that the launch titles lack the poorly acted live-action sequences or half-baked musical overtures which it says tend to be found on CD-ROM games, praising Nintendo's controversial choice of the cartridge medium with its non-existent load times and continuous fast-paced action. CD-ROMs simply cannot deliver. The review concluded that the cartridge-based Nintendo 64 delivers blistering speed and tack-sharp graphics that are unheard of on personal computers and make competing 32-bit disc-based consoles from Sega and Sony seem downright sluggish. Time magazine named it their 1996 Machine of the Year, saying the machine had done to video gaming what the 707 did to air travel. The magazine said the console achieved the most realistic and compelling three-dimensional experience ever presented by a computer. Time credited the Nintendo 64 with revitalizing the video game market. Rescuing this industry from the dustbin of entertainment history, the magazine suggested that the Nintendo 64 would play a major role in introducing children to digital technology in the final years of the 20th century. The article concluded by saying the console had already provided the first glimpse of a future where immensely powerful computing will be as common and easy to use as our televisions. Popular Electronics complimented the system's hardware, calling its specifications quite impressive. It found the controller comfortable to hold and the controls to be accurate and responsive. Developer Factor 5, who created some of the system's most technologically advanced games along with the system's audio development tools for Nintendo, said, "The N64 is really sexy because it combines the performance of an SGI machine with a cartridge. We're big arcade fans, and cartridges are still the best for arcade games or perhaps a really fast CD-ROM. But there's no such thing for consoles yet." As of 1998 sales, the Nintendo 64 was in heavy demand upon its release. David Cole, industry analyst, said, "You have people fighting to get it from stores." Time magazine called the purchasing interest that rare and glorious middle-class cabbage patch doll frenzy. The magazine said celebrities Matthew Perry, Steven Spielberg's office, and some Chicago Bulls players called Nintendo to ask for special treatment to get their hands on the console. During the system's first 3 days on the market, retailers sold 350,000 of 500,000 available console units. During its first 4 months, the console yielded 500,000 unit sales in North America. Nintendo successfully outsold Sony and Sega early in 1997 in the US, and by the end of its first full year, 3.6 million units were sold in the United States. Business Wire reported that the Nintendo 64 was responsible for Nintendo's sales having increased by 156% by 1997. After a strong launch year, the decision to use the cartridge format is said to have contributed to the diminished release pace and higher price of games compared to the competition, and thus Nintendo was unable to maintain their lead in America. The company would continue to outsell the Sega Saturn throughout the generation, but would trail behind the PlayStation. In Japan, the console was not as successful, failing to outsell the PlayStation and even the Sega Saturn. Benimaru Ito, a developer for Earthbound 64 and friend of Shigeru Miyamoto, speculated in 1997 that the Nintendo 64's lower popularity in Japan was due to the lack of role-playing video games. Nintendo reported that the system's vintage hardware and software sales had ceased by 2004. 3 years after the GameCube's launch, as of December 31, 2009, the Nintendo 64 had yielded a lifetime total of 5.54 million system units sold in Japan, 20.63 million in the Americas, and 6.75 million in other regions, for a total of 32.93 million units. Legacy. The Nintendo 64 remains one of the most recognized video game systems in history, and its games still have impact on the gaming industry. Designed in tandem with the controller, Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time are widely considered by critics and consumers to be some of the greatest and most influential games of all time. GoldenEye 007 is one of the most influential games for the shooter genre. The LX64 is a Nintendo 64 design in arcade form, designed by Seta in cooperation with Nintendo, and sold from 1998 to 2003 only in Japan.